Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Hello everyone, welcome to this video in which I will be discussing various issues relating to religion, culture, politics, and the crisis of the modern world with Alex. My name is Jacob. I am a Muslim and a very comfortable and indeed proud to be a Western and English Muslim. I see no tension between those things. And in fact, I view Islam as something which, as well as being true, also has the potential to revive Western culture and its best traditions from its current moribund state. I'm here today with Alex, who shares many of my concerns about the state of our society and culture, but is from a different religious background. And I hope that we will be able to shed a little bit of light on how both of our religious traditions have common ground in response to the problems of the modern world, and hopefully to illustrate a more serious response to our situation than is offered by the alt-right and other identitarian or ethnocentric movements. So I'll let Alex introduce himself now.
Thank you, Jacob. As Jacob mentioned, I'm Alex. I'm an Orthodox Christian, that is to say, a member of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And in a similar way to Jacob, I feel no tension between this and what would today be called my identity as an Englishman, despite the fact that it's a religion which many people today would see as something perhaps Oriental, Eastern, exotic, not necessarily fully compatible with life in the modern West. And in some ways, that might not be necessarily an untrue statement, but it's certainly not a faith tradition which is completely incompatible with Western life in the way that many people think. And so Jacob and I hope to both find some common ground with regards to our different approaches to not only our politics but our way of life as in our respective faiths. But because we don't agree on everything, that's what's going to hopefully make it more interesting. So I look forward to discussing lots of topics, and I hope you all enjoy it as well.
So let's start off by talking about the universal and unavoidable issue of the current cultural crisis of the modern world. What do you think is the reason behind this response to it offered by large sections of the sort of online right wing, who have essentially said the issue is identity, and the response to the anomie, the breakdown, the uncertainty that we see in the modern West is to reassert some kind of narrow or exclusionary ethnic identity and subjugate other concerns towards that? So why do you think this has become so prevalent, and what would be a better alternative approach?
I think this identitarian, as it's come to be known, or alt-right response to the problems of the modern Western world has come about as a natural but erroneous response to the fact that the cultural left goes on so much itself about the problem of identity. You hear a lot of talk about identity politics, and you have people like Jordan Peterson come out today and say how awful identity politics is and how we all need to focus on how that we are individuals. But ultimately, all these different ways of thinking about politics derive from some sort of school of liberal or leftist thinking. Even if you claim to be an identitarian right-winger, to focus so much upon your identity as a racial being is, I think, ultimately flawed, and it's related to various left-wing ideologies, which you can no doubt get into details of later. But whilst, of course, your ethnicity is a natural part of anyone's identity as a person, to sort of elevate it to the status of almost idolatry is, I think, very unhealthy. And I think this is what defines the problem of the West so much, is that we create these little idolatries for ourselves. We claim to have values as a liberal cultural machine. These liberal values amount to very, very little. There's no cornerstone, really, that most people can go back to. There's no agreed upon set of rules. There's no truth, to put it in very stark terms. There's no truth that people can agree upon. There's no transcendent set of ideas which are set from above that people, no matter who they are, can rely upon. And so in that sense, many people feel set against each other, and they're obliged to, when they realize something is wrong with the modern world, as there very correctly is, they fall back upon these destructive ideas which will ultimately just lead to more violence and hatred than there already is between the left and right today.
It's interesting you mentioned that these so-called right-wing movements are in many ways actually liberal. Of course, one can think of standout examples of what we might call coercive liberalism, in which the boundaries of the community they want to defend are essentially defined through commitment to liberalism, or that's sort of bound up with ethnicity in some incoherent way. You look, for instance, at the so-called far-right Alternative for Deutschland, where their leader was a lesbian investment banker, one of whose main concerns was defending so-called homosexual rights against the so-called threat of Islam, which is, in most respects, not remotely a conservative or traditional response, but a response that reaffirms all of the values and the dogma of advanced liberalism.
Yeah, there appears to be this strange attitude amongst so-called conservatives in the modern right that conserving liberal values is what conservatism has kind of boiled itself down to, that the cultural sort of struggle against traditional moral values has been won, and so therefore this kind of primordial soup of moral uncertainty is something that needs to be conserved against any group that offers something more tangible. So if you want to live as a Muslim in the modern world, that's okay, but it's only okay if you subordinate your Islam to liberalism. The same for Christianity. Many of the Protestant state churches of Europe have given into this. I think partly because they have historically been so closely tied to the state, they feel obliged to kind of subordinate themselves to it nowadays when their congregations are dwindling. Any attempt to kind of preserve traditional Christian moral values are kind of looked down upon, and you're considered to be some sort of extremist if you don't, or rather the Christian understanding of love and forgiveness is kind of perverted to an extent that there's supersedes all moral considerations which traditionally were very important in Christianity. And so, of course, when Muslim immigrants come over, which paradoxically the liberal establishment is not opposed to, but when it does happen, there is this obligation upon conservative Muslims to drop their conservatism, or to drop their orthodoxy, if that's the term that you'd prefer to use, because you can only really be compatible with society if you obey the liberal rules, which is, don't consider homosexual acts to be a sin, don't consider traditional marriage to be the only way that people can have acceptable sexual relations, and all these other considerations that traditionally have been considered very important within society.
And one of the paradoxes of this is that despite this rhetoric and this shibboleth that so-called diversity has become among establishment forces, especially on the left wing of politics, the effect of their agenda is to remove all real diversity. If one's primary belief set is actually a kind of cosmopolitan liberalism, some kind of belief in a neutral public sphere, that obviously erodes the extent to which you can have any real difference in worldview. And at the same time, this incredible cultural leveling is going on through the forces of media and globalization that removes any real distinctiveness from the nations and tribes of the world. And this rhetoric of diversity really seems to mean that we may all have different skin colors and may all have different identities, which one is obliged to respect in some vague way. And yet, beneath the level of skin, everyone must be the same bland consumer, the same mediocrity, and essentially personhood and real individuality are completely eroded.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think uh, anything which in the past may have set someone up, distinguished someone from someone else. So, for instance, whilst the Englishman might well be distinguishable from the Frenchman. I mean, these days, if you want to behave in an English way, it's kind of almost like a hobby that you do on the side. At heart, all you are is you're part of this kind of Western global monoculture that seem to want to propagate. And if you have a religion, then that's just a hobby that you do on the side. It's not something which should define your life. Your life should be defined by how you interact with the liberal system as it stands.
Yes, there's this great fallacy that liberalism can be neutral. It's most exemplified by the almost inexplicably influential philosophy of John Rawls, whose whole notion is that we have to set aside what he calls our comprehensive worldviews when dealing with the public realm. The problem, of course, is that this really only makes sense if it relies upon the comprehensive worldview that is liberalism, which has its own metaphysics, its own teleology, its own sense of transcendence in a transmuted form. And this idea of Englishness as a hobby is very interesting. I think immediately when you say that of Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's touted as some kind of great traditional Englishman who is some kind of countercultural force, but his entire persona just illustrates how completely dead the English character is, and the same is true of most other countries to a greater or lesser extent. But to dress and speak in the way he does, to quote Horace and Virgil and wear a three-piece suit, these things may once have meant something. They did once mean something. They were part of a community that had a certain set of ideals and cultural norms in which behaving in a certain way made sense. But now it's entirely inauthentic, and what you have left is a kind of shell and a live-action role play in which these things are so completely in such complete abeyance as an actual part of a moral community that they become absurd and frankly obscene.
Even quoting from the classics of ancient Greece and Rome really mean very little these days, precisely because most people have never even really given them much attention. I mean, most people don't really learn them anymore. Not even maybe some of the really wealthy people in different countries still do learn them, or by chance. People who go to certain grammar schools might still learn Latin, but for the most part, they have no direct relevance to the daily life or the daily political life of the country. So when someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg comes along and on the face of things seems to offer a more attractive alternative to, say, Theresa May, to people who are traditionally minded, I think it can appear quite exciting, but if you sort of scratch beneath the surface, you can see he also is very quick to just back up establishment positions and say, yes, "Oh, no, I would never actively oppose the government as it is," which is really, I think, all you can do. If you certainly speak out against it and criticize it, but he's usually quite reluctant to do that because at the end of the day, he's part of an established political party, and he's in a career which necessitates loyalty to an established political party, and that's always going to make whatever sort of eccentricities he has purely eccentricities and nothing further.
Yes. The problem in many ways with the modern world is that, or rather one of the fallacies in responding to it, is to think you can simply imitate the past, imitate a culture that once existed, as he does in the way he dresses and acts. And the fact is that doing those things does not have the meaning that it had when that culture existed, and it's not possible to retrieve a culture in that way. A quite different approach has to be taken, and if culture in any real sense is to be rebuilt, it's not going to be done by adopting the superficial habits of people of earlier generations.
I think it was Chesterton who said that progressives just make mistakes and conservatives prevent them from being corrected. Um, in a sense, that's really the situation we've reached in this kind of political stagnation, where if you call yourself a conservative in the mainstream sense, it means very little other than I like capitalism, and I think maybe that we shouldn't engage in the same level of change as a progressive would want. But even then, a lot of people who are members of the Conservative Party these days have got no real ideological connection to the conservatism of even the sort of 19th century, in which conservatism was even then considered to be distinct from Toryism, which is an even older form of English traditional thought. But as you say, there's no real practical way to think about dragging the past into the present. You have to consider that if you want to change the future, you've got to do it in such a way where you might well take influences from the traditions of your ancestors and look into the past for insight. But you're not going to do it by enforcing a way of life which has died out. And you're not going to revive it because people just simply won't take to it, because people have got no connection to it anymore.
It's absolutely right.
I think that's one of our problems, is that we have no connection with the ways of life that previously existed. So even if we wanted to bring them back, they'd have to be completely reworked. It would have to be made compatible with different things that have arisen since then.
That's right. As far as the Conservative Party in Britain goes, I still think that the politics tutor at Oxford gave the best summation of it, that it once believed in conserving the great institutions of England. It then came to believe the greatest of all these institutions was in fact itself, and is now conserving that in its own power. And that's one of the reasons I no longer call myself a conservative. The other is that conservatism as a set of doctrines only came into existence with modernity as an incoherent response or protest against it. It only came into being with the rupture of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, and has never offered a serious alternative. There have been some, like de Maistre in France, who offered a kind of fossilized, what Charles Taylor calls a baroque vision of a static pre-modern order, but which has lost its moral foundations. And then there are those who have believed conservatism is about endless compromise, as most of those in Britain do, and endlessly accepting the modern world while pretending that this is some kind of great tradition. Yes, and I suppose the issue of authenticity in culture relates to what one takes to be first principles, and whether one takes that to be identity or to be something transcendent, which seems to give a foundation for communities and cultures that are not constructed for their own sake. In a way, if you're living only in order to follow the rules of a certain culture, you're not. At least that's inauthentic, and if you believe in an absolute truth, as you say, it's also something quite wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think for many people, absolute truth has been replaced with the sort of political or moral stances that they have sort of clung to as a result of not having anything else to cling to. So, for instance, you see in America at the moment the controversy surrounding Trump and Kavanaugh, the country is really divided out into these two camps where there's no real hope of any kind of political justice arising from the situation, because on the one hand, you have a group of people who think that Trump and all his people he's appointed are being really badly treated, set up by the Democrats who just want to oppose anything that he does. They're ruining the lives of right-wingers deliberately because they're full of hatred for anything which is not their own ideology. And similar situation for the left, reflected back the other way. They feel as though, for instance, Dr. Ford's story against Kavanaugh is just a case of the patriarchy not believing a poor, abused woman, and this sort of oppressive idea of the authoritarian man stamping on the face of a poor, oppressed group of people has had victory once again. And neither side is ever going to appreciate where the other one is coming from, because fundamentally they refuse to acknowledge that the other side might actually have a point. Because as far as they're concerned, the other side is completely evil. And you get some anomalies, some people in the middle ground, people with maybe left-wing tendencies or right-wing tendencies who would consider themselves moderate, who can see the truth in both sides, if that's even the term anymore. But they really are anomalies. You don't really get that. They're certainly not large enough to make any real difference in politics. And that's why I think politics has become so toxic these days, is because people just are constantly at each other's throats about it. And there's no discussion, there's no interest in discussion at all, because people have pretty much made up their minds, and they will always fall back upon either the sort of left liberalism or right liberalism that backs up their position.
Yeah, this division is made worse in America with their peculiar civil religion involving the attribution of a kind of semi-divine status to the Constitution, which means that any fundamental disagreement becomes encoded in terms of being anti-American, anti-Constitution, and questioning, or becomes bound up in this divinity, this political divinity, and therefore has a more existential import. But you see the same thing all over the Western world to some extent. Part of the bitterness perhaps just relates to the absence of any common sense of a common worldview. And with regards to the question of identity and culture again, the problem really seems to be, as you say, but I suppose in a different sense, the absence of a middle ground. Because on the one hand, we have this reflexive, knee-jerk defense of so-called diversity, in reality, which there is none, but which is also constitutive of what Roger Scruton calls the culture of renunciation, this attempt to reject all that is good and beautiful in traditional Western cultures in the name of a kind of sterile multiculturalism. And then, on the other hand, you have the reaction against that, which is a crude ethnocentrism, which ascribes ultimate value to some kind of racially pure community. The middle ground is impossible to reach, which is a genuine particularism in which there is a value attached to certain communities, but which does not entail believing that their own folkways, their own culture is superior and is a blueprint or something that can be imposed upon others, or that they are superior as a people, that, as the Quran says, for example, in as its meanings would say in English, that people have been made into different nations and tribes, they may know one another, and there is this sense of mutual benefit from having different cultures within the universal umar of submission to God. Without that transcendent point, without that absolute, it's very hard to find this middle ground, because one tries to attach ultimate value to some earthly thing, whether that be liberalism and diversity and tolerance, or whether it be one's own race and tribe.
Of course, well, we believe that God made all nations, but he set up the human race such that this is what they're inclined to organize themselves into. At the same time, God is knowable by all nations, and they're all able to cooperate with one another through the medium of God's ordinances. But of course, not only has God been cut out of the equation, but a meaningful sense of nationhood has been cut out of the equation as well. It seems to have been this response to the Second World War. In Douglas Murray's book about the strange death of Europe, I mean, there are lots of good things in that book and lots of bad things, and I won't go into a sort of a book review mode, but he does say that the leaders of Europe seem to have they have no sort of self-confidence, they've given up on themselves. And broadly speaking, I think what he means is that there was the sense after the Second World War that truth was up for grabs after the horrors of Nazism had kind of disappeared. There was no real way of thinking about nationhood anymore without it immediately being connected to the idea of racial extremism and genocide. And any kind of rational discussion about that ended up being taken to that extreme, and you end up with, is it Godwin's law, the one about Hitler always being brought up in a conversation? Right, yeah. Hitler sort of emerged as this new Satan figure who, instead of men being tempted by their sins, men are tempted by the temptation to devolve into extremist behavior. And so this kind of, there was this sense that in order to be pure, we need to purge ourselves of any kind of identity which is not revolved around identifying with tolerance and acceptance of anything that, and repudiating your own heritage. Now, of course, this kind of ethnocentrism that you talk about can be destructive in itself. You only need to look at the way that certain other cultures were treated under colonial rule to see how this can lead to problems, genocidal problems, violence, oppression, all these different things which are genuine concerns. But at the same time, it's almost as though in stripping back the culture and identity of the peoples of Europe, they were stripped down to the bone, and even the bones were not spared, such that there was nothing whatsoever really left of them, culturally speaking, and people were left without any sense of meaningful, anything meaningful to associate with. I mean, you talked about Roger Scruton. He's always mentioned that traditionally England has been, whilst fairly ethnically homogenous for most of its existence, it also has been able to accept people from other cultures who were able to identify with the land and where they lived in the country nevertheless. But even the land is not to be spared these days. I mean, in a literal sense in terms of concreting over the countryside, but also in a spiritual sense in that we're almost taught to be ashamed of the land that we come from. And whilst there are certainly things that we should be taught that the Britain did wrong during its existence, I'm not sure if being ashamed of where you come from is the right way to approach reconciling these issues.
Yes, the point about colonial crimes is interesting because it seems that this is a kind of inversion of a previous excess of pride. Whether one sees the problems and often the horrors that existed under colonialism as unique, or whether simply the result of the unique power and reach of the modern West, whether they were uniquely evil or not. Obviously, there were immense cruelties, immense oppressions, etc. But in reaction to that, we now have this shift to an opposite polarity of shame in one's own identity, which is equally unhealthy. And I think your point about English identity is very interesting because this sense of belonging to a land rather than to a racial group or to a state or to a community defined by commitment to a certain idea, like America defined by its commitment to the liberal idea of the US Constitution, or to some extent France in the absence of, in the wake of the revolution and the reconstruction of the nation through those ideals. Well, this is, to my mind, a very healthy kind of identity, and also one of the reasons I still have a degree of hope for the future of England and Britain, because it's fundamentally not something that can be in tension with Islam. Commitment to a liberal worldview, well, that can be in tension with it. An obsession with one's race, that's also in tension with it. But this sense of belonging to a land is very, very compatible. And one thinks of examples of how that can be taken on by Muslims in Britain. For instance, so for instance, I recall I spoke to a Muslim school teacher who was from an immigrant descended background, and she had been in this school teaching children about the Islamic idea, but it's also an idea found in all serious religions, of the conquest of the lower self, the animal self, which we call the nafs, using the medium of Shakespeare. There's been scholarship on Shakespeare by Martin Lings, who's one of the notable converts to Islam in Britain's recent past, and his interpretation of Shakespeare was that it expresses an analogical kind of inner truth about this spiritual conquest. He talks about Hamlet, for example, where kingship is equated with self-conquest and kingship over one's own lower soul. So those children were engaging in a far more real and authentic connection with English culture than anything that the vast majority, or perhaps even virtually all, children of a white British ethnic background of that age would ever encounter. And that seems to me to be something very, very hopeful for the future.
It's certainly more positive than the way that Shakespeare is taught in many schools today, in the vast majority of schools, where he's sort of thrown at the children without very much of an in-depth explanation, even as to the context of the way in which people lived in those days, or about the messages which still run through Shakespeare that are relevant to today, and it becomes very boring for them and they lose interest and what have you. I think, traditionally speaking, the reason why the West has been so reluctant to engage seriously with religion such as Islam is because it defined itself from a very, very early stage as a cultural bloc which stood over and against the East, and that included Eastern Christianity. The Latin Christianity treated Eastern Christians very notoriously badly during the Crusades, and when they took over Constantinople, they banned Eastern Christians from performing their liturgies and what have you. Now, of course, for the most part, many of these issues are being resolved today with ecumenical dialogues and what have you. Even still, Eastern Christianity is much more reluctant than other forms of Christianity to engage in serious ecumenical dialogue because it fears that its teachings will go the same way as Western Christianity, that it will be forced to compromise on its moral teachings in particular in order to move with the times, which is not something that traditionally Christianity or any religion has really been that bothered with. And so it's possible for Christians and Muslims to engage in serious dialogue and to share these literary traditions with each other. And Islam can find ways, I think, through these mediums to, I don't want to use the word integrate because that often implies a sort of subordination to liberalism these days, but it can certainly adopt an English character such that people probably feel more comfortable with it whilst retaining its orthodox doctrines, just as Christianity, in an orthodox sense, is able to interact very healthily with pretty much any culture it comes into contact with, so long as its mind isn't closed to engaging with literature and with academic work, which is maybe a little bit different to what it might traditionally be used to, but which could nevertheless be of interest to it. We've talked, not on video, we've talked before about the closing of the Western mind. You've written an essay about this, I believe, somewhere. And it's an interesting topic about considering that there is so much critique of the West comes actually from a Western liberal perspective, such that any sort of meaningful radical critique of where we are at the present time is actually just as establishmentarian as anything that it was trying to critique in the first place.
There is this so-called post-colonialist discourse, which many Muslims have unfortunately taken on, where colonialism as a activity and where the West as a power are critiqued, but only in the name of Western values, and any real engagement with non-Western values through this post-colonial lens, well, it's as anti-colonial as postmodernism is anti-modern. It's wholly shaped by colonialism because implicitly they rely upon liberal secular values to critique the effects that colonialism had upon the native peoples of colonized places. And this is no real alternative. It's just another transmutation of the Western zeitgeist. And then, as you say, also this engagement between Muslims and Eastern Christians in particular was extremely fruitful throughout most of its history. One thinks, for example, of, if I remember rightly, John of Damascus, one of the main critics of Islam, one of the great polemicists against Islam in the early centuries since the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, when he was actually at the same time, while doing this, being protected by the Muslim rulers from his fellow Christians who wanted to persecute him because of his views on religious icons. So there is this great history of engagement, especially in the East. And there's also a great history within Islam of, as you say, adapting to local cultures without the compromise of the fundamental orthodoxy and orthopraxy. You look, for example, at the Hui Chinese, who've been Muslim for over 1,000 years, a small group of the Han Chinese, the majority ethnic group of China, but who've developed a very distinctly Islamic and Chinese culture, who at the same time as being completely Orthodox Muslims also build mosques that look like native pagodas, who have developed their own form of calligraphy in which they combine or rather draw Arabic characters in the style of Chinese calligraphy, who have also historically studied the writings of Confucius and practiced certain Taoist martial arts. And this is a far greater kind of engagement with the real culture than you can have from the modern standpoint. So one of the things about the closing of the Western mind, I mean, that essay was based on Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind, which I believe is still one of the best books about the contemporary cultural condition to have been published. And he makes the central point that if you don't have your own culture, you can't genuinely be open to anyone else's. If you don't have something to critique, something to doubt, or a framework for engagement and understanding, then you can only have a superficial understanding of anyone else's. And he describes how his students in the 1980s, the first generation to have wholly grown up in the post-68 free love, anomistic world in which sort of John Lennon and some kind of bastardized Hinduism and Buddhism had become cultural mainstream as opposed to Protestant Christianity, and not having a serious worldview, they could never comprehend that anyone else would either. And any attempt to open them to the great traditions of the world, despite their profession to be open-minded, was futile and superficial, which is an incredibly sad thing.
Yeah, indeed. And it was interesting. I was reading John of Damascus's book the other day, and it is interesting how he's most well known for writing a book called the exact exposition of the Orthodox faith, which is essentially the Orthodox Church's seminal work of systematic theology. But also, as you say, he wrote a book called Against Heresies, in which he does attack the Prophet Muhammad and Islam in general. But as you say, at the same time, he worked for the Muslim Caliph. The Caliph was his employer. He worked as an administrator for him. And as you say, he was protected by him from iconoclasts during that controversy. And you see in his work that actually he frequently dialogued with Muslims, as did Gregory Palamas, another Greek father who dialogued with Sufis and exchanged a lot of ideas with Muslims in the East. But John of Damascus, his work is quite jokey in places. He sort of implies that he sort of makes jokes with Muslims, not in a sort of a critical way, but they sort of they're able to sort of exchange jokey remarks about each other's beliefs, and even though they don't agree, they sort of get on quite well. At the end of the day, John of Damascus himself wasn't Arab, and he interacted primarily with Arabs, but there was, as I say, there was dialogue between Greeks and Muslims when the Ottomans took over Anatolia and Greece. There was a fair amount of cooperation, and obviously the Greek Orthodox Christians had their own communities at that time under an Islamic polity, but they were able to maintain their own laws and customs within those communities that they ran. And the Greek Archbishop of Constantinople said, "I would rather see the Turkish turban in the streets of the city than a Latin mitre," in reference to the way that the Western Christians had treated the Eastern Christians earlier. And the Ottoman sultans continued the tradition of appointing bishops to appointing the position of the Patriarch of Constantinople, which the Byzantine emperors had done so previously, because they sort of took on that position themselves when they conquered the city. And whilst, of course, we can't say there weren't controversies and there weren't cases of violence, in generally speaking, these groups have survived even to this day, such as the Copts in Egypt and Arab Christians in Palestine. So for the most part, then there seems to have been a peaceful coexistence which permitted the exchange of ideas. It's only really since the advent of the 20th century that things have started to become more difficult, and I think that's because of the influence of Western ideas on the East. But maybe that's a controversy that's something to discuss another time. But for the most part, there certainly was, as you say, a free exchange of ideas between East and West, which was healthy for a large part of history. And well, I say East and West, I mean Christians and Muslims for a large part of history, which is something that the modern West, in its cultural anomie that you describe, needs to look at seriously, I think.
I think there's also perhaps greater theological similarity between Islam and the Eastern Orthodox tradition than there is to the Western Catholic tradition in terms of a slightly different understanding of things like the Trinity. Is that right in your view?
I mean, the Trinity it's always been a sticking point that has been difficult, even in Eastern Christianity, to be reconciled against Islam.
I'm not saying the same. I'm saying just that it seems to have been somewhat closer than the differences with regard to Western Christianity.
Well, certainly Eastern Christianity hasn't been affected by the innovations of the West, because Eastern Christianity never accepted the infallible authority of the Pope, and from a very early stage kind of demarcated itself off against the Western papal tradition. And so it's never accepted doctrines such as the Immaculate Conception of Mary. It's never accepted doctrines such as purgatory. It's always had its own prayer rules and such. It's never accepted interpolations into the creed such as the Western Filioque. I mean, it's still broadly speaking part of a similar religious tradition, but as you say, in how it approaches religion, it is not defined by the same theological innovations as we're seeing in the West. For instance, one of the most important ones you see is that whilst in the West, which came under the influence of Augustinian theology, this idea of original sin being something which could only be washed away by baptism and the belief in Christ as Redeemer, the East has never really accepted, never has at all, accepted Augustine's theory on original sin. And the reason for that is because of this idea of the consensus patrum, which a Latin term meaning the consensus of the fathers, where the many hundreds of church fathers that existed in the early days of Christianity, whilst they disagreed on a lot, they agreed on a lot as well. One of the things that they agreed upon was that human nature is disposed towards sinful actions, and there are some which, there are some sins which are worse than others, and there are some sins which the majority of people won't commit. But nevertheless, we are inclined towards, I suppose, this lower state of being, this, as you termed it, the nafs, which we have the ability to overcome through God's grace. And may God help us all with that. But there's never been this sense, as there is in the West, that we're all tainted with the same sin as Adam. I mean, Adam's disobedience is considered to be sort of the turning point at which humanity opened itself up to this possibility of being disconnected from God by its sins. But we're not all guilty of the sin of eating the forbidden fruit. That's certainly a ridiculous claim, because you can't be guilty for something you yourself haven't done. So in this sense, any sins that you commit are your own, and you're not responsible for anybody else's, unless you encourage someone else to sin, in which case that's a sin itself. But there's this idea of Augustinian guilt for original sin is not the same in the Eastern tradition as it is in the West.
Yes, and what you described is very similar to our view, which is that, as you say, we cannot be responsible for the sin of Adam, and indeed Adam, peace be upon him, was forgiven for the sin that he committed.
Yes.
So there's this greater reliance on individual righteousness as opposed to some kind of collective redemption from a sin which we inherit despite not being related to our own choices. And we would agree that it seems absurd that humanity can be tainted by the action of its forefathers. It seems to violate the notion of divine justice. But Augustine is also interesting because one of the ways in which the West seems to have undergone this inversion in the last few decades, you look, for instance, at what the Western Orientalists, so-called, that's one of those terms that is thrown around a lot, but those who studied Eastern faiths, some of whom were very good scholars, some of whom were tainted by their prejudices to a greater or lesser degree. But in any case, what they said about Islam 100 years ago was that it is not at all what is said now, that it is repressive, that it holds back the freedom of individuals to express their sexual desire. That's one of the main problems the West seems to have with Islam now. What they said 100 years ago is quite the opposite, that it's hedonistic and immoral because it affirms life to a much greater degree in that respect than traditional Western Christianity. For instance, we never had an issue with contraception, in some limited circumstances with divorce. It's not approved of, but it was never the fundamentally evil act it was seen in the Catholic tradition. So there's this greater degree of affirmation of within limits of human sexuality, and this connects to the legacy of Augustine, of course, whose views on original sin were bound up with his kind of revulsion, I think it's fair to say, about human sexuality.
It seems to have derived from his own quite promiscuous sexual past allegedly, before he became a monk, allegedly. Yeah. So I think maybe there are some fathers who are more disgusted by it than others, and for the most part, as you say, Eastern Christianity has followed this idea that sexuality can be affirmed within the proper context. Of course, it still wouldn't affirm sex outside of marriage, but it would, nevertheless, as you say, it doesn't quite have the same stringent revulsion for it, and it sees marriage as the proper way rather than as the best, as an excuse to just do something which otherwise would lead to the extinction of the human race.
Yes, the sexual revolution of the last 5 decades seems to me to be a kind of vomiting up of a civilization that attempted to ingest Augustine and finally found it was unable to stomach him, and now it's gone to the opposite extreme. In many ways, I suppose, analogous to the renunciation of cultural pride around the same sort of pivot, which really was the 1960s, this when this culture of renunciation developed in reaction against ethnocentrism. So
I think it's another case of
this idea of balance. But yes,
right. I think it's again this return to the case of that people reacted against an extreme with an extreme, and they were unable to really see how there are actually some ideas in the traditional view which adequately balance the more destructive tendencies of the extreme of anomie that appears to have sexual anomie that appears to have developed out of the sexual revolution.
You touched on something a couple of minutes ago as well about individualism, and I think it was connected to I use individualism to mean not in its modern sense of license, but individualism in that the individual is the ultimate, indeed, really the only moral subject at a basic level, which you say is a feature of Eastern Christianity in that it does not believe in this kind of, perhaps I'm reading too much into it, but yeah, it does not believe in this kind of inherited sin and the need in the Catholic tradition. There's this sense of corporate salvation through the church who intermediates with God and helps to overcome this inherited sin. And Islam also has this individualist moral sense. The only reality is individual at a basic level. There's this eternal drama of souls. It's only individual souls who are judged for their own actions. Of course, you exist in relation to others, but that's the fundamental salvific thing. And that's also, I think, another facet to this cultural convergence. That's actually also a very English trait, this kind of moral individualism, and I think it's been so for about 1,000 years or more, but that was never thought to be in contrast with the idea of moral responsibility, and never thought to entail a permissive moral code. It's another respect, I think, in which one can be more authentically English through Islam, and perhaps also through Eastern Christianity, than one can by attempting to revive its now, totally moribund historic religion.
I mean, one has to remember that, of course, an Eastern Christian would still say that the crucifixion of Christ has salvific power, but only in the sense that an Eastern Christian would say that through the various actions of his life, Christ set himself up as the perfect model to be imitated by his followers. And so in this sense, we believe that when we die, we will be held in a state of either peace whilst awaiting the final judgment, or in a sense, if we're not worthy of that, then in a state that's cut off from God. God forbid any of us would ever be in such a state, but if such is the case, then that will be the case, and then eventually, whenever God wills it to be so, he will call us all up for the final judgment, and we'll each be judged according to our deeds, that we have the things we have done, both good and bad. And then he will make a judgment as to whether or not we are worthy to enter heaven or paradise, or whatever you want, whichever term you want to use with him, or whether we need to undergo some sort of punishment.
Yes, we have a similar notion of the punishment of the grave. It connects to seeing one's place in paradise or hell before the day of judgment, and the bliss or terror that induces, but it's rather similar. But perhaps
one interesting... Yes. Sorry, I just also mentioned that an interesting thing to consider is that before 1066, when King William the Conqueror took the English throne from the Saxon King Harold, the English Church was relatively independent from the papacy, and generally speaking, most scholars would consider it to have a more orthodox flavour to it. And then after William the Conqueror became king, he changed a lot of the indigenous customs of the English Church to move them into line with the Roman Church's customs. And so many Orthodox Christians in this country today are seeking to understand what these indigenous customs were. And it turns out that many of them are very similar to the customs of the Eastern Church that still exist to this day in Russia and Greece and the Middle East. And so in that sense, many of the Eastern European and Greek and Arab Christian immigrants who come to this country and set up their churches here have found that there's a whole litany of different English saints who they can ask for intercession. There are various customs which are certainly not alien at all to English ways of life in the right context. That's something which is of great interest to people like me.
Yes, that's very interesting. Even William Blake is supposed to have been a kind of Unitarian Christian, And there's even an interpretation of Jerusalem, which is really our national hymn, whereby the dark satanic mills are not factories, or not just factories, but he's also referring to the churches of his time in promoting what he saw as the error of belief in the Trinity, which is quite an interesting Muslim interpretation of that hymn. Of course, you wouldn't go so far as to not to reject the Trinity, which I think is maybe the irreconcilable difference between our religions. The notion that because, as I say, we also hold Jesus, peace be upon him, to be a great exemplar, as were all the prophets, except that we hold them all also to have been human beings and not in themselves divine.
Yes, well, this is for an Orthodox Christian, the term Orthodox, whilst it does refer to common practices amongst Eastern Christians, it also refers to the version of the creed which we use, which is a Trinitarian creed, and it is a creed which acknowledges Jesus Christ to be God incarnate, which is as you say, the two maybe irreconcilable theological differences that we hold are the fact that you as a Muslim will acknowledge that God is one and he has no partners, no equals, and the Trinity is considered to be antithetical to that belief. And the same for this idea of hypostatic union between Jesus, who had a human nature and a divine nature, which is the other main Orthodox doctrine. And these doctrines are held to by most, by the Catholic Church, by various Protestant churches, although, as you say, there is a Unitarian church which rejects the Trinity and which in some cases also would hesitate to call Jesus divine, although there are varying different nuances in the theologies. The main reason for the acknowledgement of belief in the Trinity is based upon the exegesis of Christian scripture by the fathers, the church fathers, and also the work done by the various ecumenical councils, which some of which were held, or at least the most important of which were held in Nicaea and Constantinople in the 4th century AD, which acknowledged a belief in a God of three persons, one God of three persons, which is probably the most difficult thing that people have a difficult time trying to get their head around it. Obviously, some people are able to just sort of accept it and they wouldn't think about it in too much detail. And there's something to be said for that. There is something to be said for the people who just have the faith in it and live their lives according to the faith. But when it comes to people like us who are more inclined to think about these things intellectually, it can pose a bit of a problem. So how do we understand the Trinity? Well, for a Christian, it's all about relations and about how God interacts with the created world. I suppose you'd be more qualified as a Muslim to talk about. I know neither of us are scholars or anything of this in detail, but I suppose for a Muslim God being ultimately transcendent, which Christians believe as well, the idea of God becoming a man and then existing in relation to himself in such a way is not really something which washes for Muslims.
Yes,
right?
There's certainly on a theological level, there's the idea of Tawhid, or absolute unity. God is one and not only has no partners, but also has no internal division in his attributes, actions, or being. And that's fundamental, and seems in a way to be a kind of rational principle. At least it seems contrary to reason that a person could simultaneously be holy man and holy God. But there's also the historical argument which relates to the other essential difference, which is the belief in the prophethood of Muhammad, peace be and blessings be upon him, because his message was, of course, of radical monotheism, and if one believes it to be a true message, then one has to accept that doctrine. I'm inclined to think one can make a similar historical argument regarding the veracity of his claims that one sometimes sees from Christian apologists about Jesus. The Christians have the phrase lunatic, lord, or liar, and we might adapt that to be lunatic messenger or liar. And looking at the historical evidence, the other two options seem totally unsustainable. That there is no serious historical case to be made that Muhammad was God forbids such a possibility, was mad or lying. And most of those from a non-Muslim background who study this have come to the same conclusion and find some kind of what seems to me to be a fudge. I think one of them, if I remember rightly, Montgomery, I'd have to check this, but he's one of the non-Muslim scholars who's recently studied this and comes to some kind of sense that there was a sincere delusion of some sort, which seems pretty hard to sustain as a coherent idea. If one genuinely and falsely believes that God is speaking to one in such detail as we know about Muhammad's revelation, then that would be a form of madness. But in any case, yeah, it also relates, of course, to our historical differences regarding that.
I mean, historically, Eastern Christianity has viewed Islam to be a development of a heresy of Christianity which had existed from a very early stage, which was known as Arianism. This belief, after an Egyptian priest called Arius, who taught that God was one, that Jesus was not equal to God. He did teach that Jesus might have been something like God, but he certainly wouldn't say that he was. The traditional, like John of Damascus argued that because there's this figure Bahira in the Islamic tradition of this monk who met Muhammad and predicted that he would be a prophet. I believe John of Damascus argued, well, Muhammad obviously met with this monk who was an Arian or a Nestorian or something like that, and then was taken in by his teachings and decided that he had received divine revelations which augmented those. So the reason why most Orthodox Christians have never been able to accept it is because, as far as they've been concerned, it's a heresy, which, if true, means that an Orthodox Christian could never ever adopt it, because he would put his soul in jeopardy by doing so. But of course, if Muhammad's genuine prophet, I suppose you could say the opposite is true. But if you didn't become a Muslim, then that would put you in jeopardy. But of course, when it comes to what you're convinced by, what tradition do you follow? Ultimately, it's the teachings of others that we have to weigh up and make our decision upon. So Muslims and Christians have always considered, or at least traditionally, have considered themselves to have been angling towards worship of the same God. It's just that they both consider each other to be highly unorthodox.
I think Chesterton,
that's why there are similarities.
Chesterton said a similar thing from a Catholic background about Islam, that it was a kind of a radical Protestantism, thinking of the Protestant aniconism. It was an extension of that. I'm afraid we will shortly have to finish, and we can hopefully return to this, inshallah, God willing, at a later date. But for now, I suppose I'd just like to ask you, why do you think there is currently such hostility towards Islam and Muslims in the Western world? And what, as a Christian, a faithful Christian who loves his country, but does not elevate it to the level of God, what would be the appropriate response?
I think people treat Islam and Muslims with such hostility partly because they don't know much about it. I mean, Eastern Christians face the same hostility because people just don't know about it. They don't know what it really teaches. That they have never had it explained in real detail. They know it's something different. They know it's something hostile, and for that reason, they treat it with suspicion from the off. As I say, I think also People, especially with the way that modern media works, people come to see all Muslims lumped together with this idea of Salafism, especially considering that the West or Western countries mostly interact with countries like Saudi Arabia, which are Salafist or Wahhabist nations, which aren't representative of Islam as a whole, which is, of course, Wahhabism is not Islam, it's a school or a sect of it. And the vast majority of Muslims, from what I understand, are Sunnis of various Hanafi or Maliki schools of jurisprudence.
Those are two of the four legal Orthodox schools of thought. Yes. One should just emphasize that the vast majority, even of these Salafi or Wahhabi movements that are very heterodox, the vast majority of them have no connection to the terrorist atrocities that a small number of people have committed. Though it is true that the great majority of those who tragically do support such atrocities are Salafis or Wahhabis, but that is a very different thing. But yes, I think you're right about that error of perception as well.
Nevertheless, the vast majority of Muslims are certainly not terrorists, nor are they necessarily associated with that school of Islam. So I think people often get confused. There's also a sense that Islam is not compatible with liberalism, and a lot of people are or consider themselves to be liberal. But as we've already discussed, that's nothing really that should discredit it. So when it comes to finding a way to help, if that's the right word, Muslims to live their lives here in a way that is peaceful, in a way that exposes them to as little judgment and hostility as possible, I think the answer is simply for Muslims themselves to focus on the fact that they live their lives in submission to God, who is a transcendent being and fundamentally a moral being, and that this fundamentally has got very little to do, or this fundamentally has got roots in a tradition which England itself has in its past, this traditional Christian tradition. And I think the more that we can find links between England's past and the reality of Islam in such a way that people can associate the two together in an easily reconcilable way, it will help people to understand it, and it will help us to coexist and cooperate fundamentally, without suspicion, without violence, without hatred. I think that's what we need to look towards.
Okay. Well, I would agree with that, and I think we can perhaps end by saying that despite the differences, we have more in common in believing in God and in traditional religion than we do with the secular zeitgeist, whether that be of a liberal or a racialist form. So hopefully we will speak again, but on this point we will end. So assalamu alaikum, peace upon you. Thank you all for listening. Hopefully it's been somewhat edifying, despite our obvious, certainly my obvious ignorance and lack of understanding. But hopefully it's nonetheless been a constructive and useful discussion. So we'll finish there. Thank you.
Hope you all enjoyed this, and God bless and keep you all. Goodbye.